My granddaughter wouldn't look at me when I picked her up from school that Friday afternoon. That alone should have told me something. Audrey is 8 years old, and normally the moment she spots my truck, she's running across the parking lot before I've even killed the engine, backpack bouncing, already talking about whatever happened in class that day. But that Friday, she walked out slowly, shoulders pulled in, eyes on the pavement. She climbed into the passenger seat and buckled herself without saying a word. "Hey, Bug," I said, "rough day." She shrugged and looked out the window. "I'm a retired firefighter, 31 years with the department in Columbus, Ohio. I've learned to read rooms fast, read people fast. It's a survival skill when you walk into burning buildings for a living." Something in the way Audrey was holding herself, rigid, contained, like she was trying to take up as little space as possible, put something cold in my chest. I didn't push. I drove toward home and asked about her science project, about whether she'd eaten her lunch, the usual grandfather things. She gave short answers. Not rude, just absent, like part of her was somewhere else entirely. We stopped at a red light on Morse Road, and she said very quietly, "Grandpa, do people get in trouble for keeping secrets?" I looked at her. "What kind of secrets, Bug?" She shook her head. "Never mind." The light turned green. I drove. But I didn't forget. That weekend she stayed with me and my wife, Donna. We've been watching Audrey on Fridays and some weekends for the past year, ever since my daughter Claire went back to work full-time. Claire had gone through a difficult divorce 2 years prior. Her ex-husband, Audrey's father, had relocated to Phoenix and was largely absent from Audrey's life at that point. Claire was doing everything alone, working, parenting, keeping the house. Donna and I stepped in wherever we could. Audrey was our only grandchild, and we would have moved mountains for her. Over dinner Saturday night, I watched Audrey pick at her food. She loves Donna's pot roast, has since she was old enough to choose solid food. That night she ate maybe 4 bites. "Stomach hurt?" Donna asked. "A little," Audrey said. After dinner, she asked to go to bed early, which she never does. I stood in the doorway of the guest room after Donna tucked her in and watched her lying there with her eyes open, staring at the ceiling. She didn't know I was watching. That expression on her face, I'd seen it before. Not on a child. On adults being pulled from wreckage, that 1,000-yard stare of someone whose body is present, but whose mind is still trapped somewhere terrible. I told myself I was overreacting. She was 8. She'd had a bad week. Kids have bad weeks. But I didn't sleep well that night. Sunday morning, I found her sitting at the kitchen table alone, early, before Donna was up. She had a piece of paper in front of her and she was drawing something. When she heard me come in, she flipped the paper over quickly. I poured myself a coffee and sat down across from her. Didn't say anything about the paper. Just sat there and let the quiet settle between us. After a few minutes, she said, "Grandpa, what happens if someone tells you not to tell something and you tell anyway?" "Depends on the secret," I said. She looked at her hands. "Audrey." I waited until she met my eyes. "If someone is hurting you, or someone you know, that's not a secret you have to keep. That's a secret a grown-up should help you with." Her eyes filled up. Just like that, no warning, full and spilling over. She pressed both hands flat against the table, like she was trying to hold herself down. "Mama would be so sad," she whispered. Everything in me went still. "Tell me, Bug. Whatever it is, I've got you." She told me in pieces, some of it barely audible, some of it not making complete sense the way children tell things, jumping between moments and then circling back. It took about 20 minutes. By the end of it, I had to consciously focus on keeping my breathing even, on keeping my face steady for her, because inside, I was coming apart at the seams. For the past several months, Claire had been seeing a man named Wade. He was 43, ran a landscaping company out of Westerville, had 2 kids of his own from a previous marriage who lived with their mother. Claire had met him through a mutual friend, had introduced him to us briefly at a cookout in September. He'd seemed fine. Ordinary. Polite. Even. Shook my hand, remembered to compliment Donna's coleslaw. talked about the Buckeyes with me for 10 minutes, the kind of guy you don't think about twice. Audrey told me that when Wade stayed over at the house, sometimes late at night after Claire was asleep, he would come into her room. She told me he said it was their special time, that it was something all dads did with their kids, and she just didn't know about it yet because her real dad hadn't been around. She told me he said if she told her mom would cry forever and it would be Audrey's fault. She told me it had started happening back in October. I asked her as calmly as I could manage if he had ever touched her in a way that felt wrong or hurt her. She looked at me for a long moment and then she nodded. I excused myself, walked to the back of the house, went into my bedroom and closed the door. I sat on the edge of the bed for about 90 seconds and I didn't think. I just breathed, in through the nose, out through the mouth, the way they teach you when you're a probie and you've just seen your first bad fire. Get your head right before you go back out. Then I called Claire. I didn't tell her everything on the phone. I told her she needed to come to our house right now, that it was about Audrey, that everyone was physically okay, but this was urgent. She was there in 22 minutes. I know, because I watched the clock. When Claire walked in and saw Audrey sitting at the kitchen table with Donna's arm around her, she knew before I said a word. I watched the color drain out of my daughter's face. She sat down across from Audrey and took her hands and very carefully, very quietly, asked her to tell her what she told me. Audrey did. Claire held it together through the telling. She held her daughter's hands and kept her voice level and asked the gentle, clarifying questions that Audrey needed her to ask. It wasn't until Audrey was done that Claire pressed her face into her daughter's hair, and I heard the sound my daughter made, a sound I'd never heard from her before and hoped to never hear again, a grief so raw it barely sounded human. I called 911 from the kitchen while Donna held both of them in the living room. The patrol officers who responded were professional and kind, but they explained quickly that a case like this would be handled by a detective from the Special Victims Unit. Within 2 hours, we were at the Child Advocacy Center on the east side of Columbus. I'd driven past that building 100 times and never once thought about what happened inside. The forensic interviewer was a woman named Deborah. She had short gray hair and the kind of quiet steadiness that told you immediately she'd sat across from a lot of frightened children in that room. She spoke with Audrey alone, protocol. While Claire and I sat in a separate room and watched through a one-way window, 38 of the most agonizing minutes of my life. Audrey was good, careful and clear in the way that children are when they're telling the truth. She didn't embellish. She used the words she had, sometimes childlike words, sometimes phrases that were clearly not from her own vocabulary, phrases someone else had put there. Those moments made the hair on the back of my neck stand up. Afterward, I met with a detective assigned to the case, a man named Trevino, mid-40s, compact build, the flat, calm eyes of someone who has spent years dealing with the worst things people do to each other. He was direct with me. What she's disclosed is consistent and detailed, he said. The next step is to move on the suspect before he's aware we're looking at him. How soon? I asked. Tonight, if we can manage it. He was good to his word. Wade was picked up that evening at his house in Westerville. He denied everything initially, the way they always do. But Trevino told me later there were things on his phone. Devices. A pattern that went beyond Audrey. I'm not going to put the details down. Some things don't need to be spelled out. Claire took Audrey to the pediatrician the following morning for a medical examination. I drove them and I sat in the waiting room and I looked at a water stain on the ceiling for an hour and tried not to think about what was happening behind that closed door. The doctor's report later confirmed what Audrey had disclosed. The days that followed were a particular kind of hell that I don't think you can understand unless you've lived it. Claire barely slept. She blamed herself with an intensity that was terrifying to witness. She should have seen it. She should have known. What kind of mother doesn't know? I said everything I could think to say. That predators are designed to be invisible, that the only person responsible for what happened was the man who chose to do it. That she had believed her daughter the moment she knew, and that belief was going to matter more to Audrey than anything else. She heard me. I don't think it helped much. Not right then. Audrey moved in with us temporarily while Claire got her bearings and while the forensic team did what they needed to do with the house. Audrey had nightmares the first week. Not every night, but most nights. She'd wake up calling for her mother, and I'd go to her room and turn on the lamp and sit on the edge of the bed and talk to her about nothing in particular, the bird feeder in the backyard, whether we should plant tomatoes again in the spring, what she wanted to be for Halloween even though Halloween was months away. Small talk as a lifeline. It worked most of the time. During the day she was quieter than her usual self, but present. She helped Donna in the garden. She watched cooking shows with a focus that seemed almost meditative. She asked to call her mother 4 or 5 times a day, which we always let her do. One morning she came into the kitchen while I was making eggs and said, "Grandpa, will Wade go to jail?" "Yes," I said. I was certain enough to say it that plainly. "For a long time?" "For a long time." She thought about this. "Good," she said, with a matter-of-factness that was more devastating than tears would have been. Then she asked if she could have orange juice with her eggs, and the conversation was over. The case moved through the system over the following months. Wade's lawyer tried to suppress some of the digital evidence on procedural grounds and failed. The same attorney attempted to paint Audrey's disclosure as coach, as something planted in her by a vindictive divorced mother. The forensic psychologist who testified for the prosecution dismantled that argument so thoroughly and so calmly that I watched 2 jurors shake their heads. Audrey had to testify. That was the part I'd been dreading since the beginning. She was 9 years old by then. She sat in that witness chair in a pale blue dress that Donna had helped her pick out, and she answered the questions put to her with the same quiet, careful honesty she'd shown in that room at the Child Advocacy Center. When the defense attorney pressed her on details, trying to find inconsistencies, trying to rattle her, she paused, took a breath, and said, "I don't remember that part, but I remember the other part." That's it. No drama. Just a 9-year-old who had learned the difference between what she knew and what she didn't and refused to be pushed beyond it. I don't mind saying I cried in that hallway afterward. Donna held my hand and didn't say anything, which was the right call. The jury deliberated for less than 4 hours. Guilty on all counts. At sentencing, Wade stood with that particular brand of straight-backed composure that men like him wear when they've decided to cast themselves as the real victim of the proceedings. His attorney gave a statement about his history of community involvement, his children from his previous marriage, his supposedly unblemished professional record. The judge listened. Then she looked at him over her glasses and said that the calculated, sustained nature of his conduct demonstrated a complete disregard for the well-being of a child placed in his care by trust, and that the community had an interest in ensuring he never had that opportunity again. He received 18 years. With Ohio's sentencing guidelines for his charges, he would serve no less than 15 before being eligible for parole consideration. Given his age, that math was unforgiving in a way that felt right. I didn't feel relief exactly. Relief implies the pain goes away. But something shifted. A weight I'd been carrying since that Sunday morning at the kitchen table redistributed itself slightly. Became bearable in a way it hadn't been before. Claire has done the work. That's the only way I know how to put it. She found a trauma-informed therapist for Audrey within a month of the arrest and has kept that commitment with a consistency I find remarkable given everything else she was managing. She found her own therapist too, eventually, which I think saved her. She had to rebuild the way she understood her own judgment, her own reliability as a mother. And she did that with a determination that I recognize because it's the same stubbornness she's had since she was a kid. She doesn't blame herself the way she did in those first weeks. Most days. Audrey is 10 now. She's in a soccer league that takes up most of her Saturday mornings. She has a best friend named Zoe who calls the house approximately 600 times per week. She started reading on her own this past year, novels, real ones, not picture books, and will apparently discuss at length whatever she's reading with anyone who will sit still long enough to listen. Last month, she spent 45 minutes explaining to me the plot of a book about a girl detective, and I understood approximately half of it and nodded through the rest, and it was one of the best conversations I've had in years. She still sees her therapist, Dr. Weston, every other week. There are still nights when the nightmares come back. There are days when something small, a man's voice on television with a particular tone, driving past a certain kind of neighborhood, sends her somewhere inside herself briefly. Each time she comes back, that's what resilience actually looks like up close, not the absence of the wound, but the ability to keep coming back from it. A few months after sentencing, I got a call from a woman at the Child Advocacy Center. She was a victim services coordinator, and she told me that Audrey had made a drawing during one of her sessions there. She asked if we'd be willing to let them use it in some of their family education materials with our permission. We said yes. I asked her to describe it to me. She said it was a small figure at the center of the page with thick lines coming from different directions toward her. The lines were dark, pressing in, but the figure in the middle was standing up, both arms out, and the lines weren't reaching her. Around the edges of the page, Audrey had written, in her careful third-grade print, words for the people who love you. Grandma, Grandpa, Mom, Drampa, Mom, Dr. Weston, Deborah. The lines couldn't reach her because of the people standing around her. I keep a photo of that drawing on my desk. There are things I know I will ask myself for the rest of my life. Whether I should have asked harder questions when Audrey first went quiet back in September. Whether I missed something at that September cookout. A gesture, a look, anything that might have told me what kind of man Wade was. I've gone back over that afternoon in my memory more times than I can count. I can't find the moment. Maybe it wasn't there. Maybe it was and I missed it. I'll probably never know for certain. What I've stopped doing is letting that question paralyze me. Because Audrey asked me from the passenger seat of my truck whether people get in trouble for telling secrets, and I didn't let that question go. I sat down at a kitchen table the next morning, and I waited. And I kept the door open. And she walked through it. That's what mattered. Not the moments before. The moment when I could actually do something. I spent 31 years walking into burning buildings, and my job was never to prevent the fire from starting. My job was to show up when it had already started and to get people out. That Sunday morning at my kitchen table, I showed up. I'm telling this story because there are people reading it who know something, not a suspicion, not a vague discomfort, but something. A child's face at the wrong moment. A question asked in a car on the way home from school. A drawing flipped over too quickly. You're talking yourself out of it. You're telling yourself you don't want to be wrong. You don't want to cause trouble. You don't want to be the one who blows up someone's life over a feeling. Here is what I want you to hear from a man who has seen what the alternative looks like. The trouble you're afraid to cause is nothing compared to the silence you would have to live with. Children don't have the language for everything that's being done to them. They have fragments, oblique questions, small signals. They're watching to see if you're safe enough to tell. They're testing the door before they open it. Be the person who keeps the door open. If you see the signs, a child withdrawing suddenly, flinching at a specific person, asking strange questions about secrets and trouble, knowing things a child that age should not know, report it. Call the Child Help National Child Abuse Hotline at 182-4A-SEAT-CHILD. Contact your local Child Protective Services. If you believe a child is in immediate danger, call 911. You do not need to be certain. You do not need to be their parent. You do not need to be their parent. You do not need proof. That is what investigators are for. Your job is only to make the call. Audrey is 10 years old, and last week she asked me to teach her how to change a tire. I'm not sure why that was the skill she landed on, but we spent an hour in the driveway on a Saturday afternoon, and she learned the basics and was extraordinarily proud of herself. She showed her mother when Claire came to pick her up, walking her through each step in the careful, authoritative way of someone who has recently become an expert. Claire looked over at me over Audrey's head and smiled in a way that took 10 years off her face. Whatever I had to do to get to that afternoon in my driveway, I would do again without a second's hesitation. I think about that red light on Morse Road a lot. Audrey asked me whether people get in trouble for telling secrets, and I gave her a careful answer, and then the light turned green and I drove. I didn't push. I told myself I was reading the situation, giving her space. The truth is, I was also afraid of what I might hear if I pushed harder. That fear, the fear of being wrong, of causing damage, of blowing something up that can't be put back together, is the thing that keeps people quiet when they should be loud. I know that now in a way I didn't before. I spent 3 decades running toward fires because I understood that hesitation cost lives. Somehow I had to learn that same lesson all over again, sitting in a truck with my 8-year-old granddaughter, before I really applied it to the people I loved most. What I've come to understand is that the people who act in moments like that one, who keep the door open instead of letting it swing shut, aren't necessarily braver than everyone else. They've just made a prior decision about what kind of person they're going to be before the moment arrives. Audrey's therapist, Dr. Weston, said something to me once that I've turned over many times since. She said that children don't disclose in straight lines. They test the ground first. They ask sideways questions. They flip drawings face down and watch to see whether you notice. What they're measuring is whether you can be trusted to handle what they're about to put down in front of you. The moment I sat across from Audrey at that kitchen table and kept still and kept quiet and kept the door open, I passed the test I didn't know I was taking. That's what I'd call doing right by someone, not the dramatic version, not the moment in the courtroom or the call to 911, but the quiet version. The Sunday morning version with bad coffee and a piece of paper flipped face down on the table. Integrity isn't mostly grand gestures. It's a series of small choices about whether to stay present when staying present is uncomfortable. The hard part is what Claire had to do afterward. She had to rebuild the way she trusted her own mind. She had to take every assumption she'd made about Wade, pleasant, ordinary, fine, and understand that those assumptions weren't failures of intelligence. They were the result of deliberate deception by someone who had practiced it carefully, working through that without letting it collapse her judgment permanently, without deciding that she could never trust anyone again. That took a sustained effort of will that I find remarkable every time I think about it. That's not something that happens automatically. It's something you choose to do over and over on the days when it would be easier to stop. And Audrey. What Audrey did at 9 years old, sitting in a witness chair in a pale blue dress, answering questions with quiet precision, holding the line when the defense attorney pushed, that was not a small thing. She had every reason to shrink, to go vague, to let the pressure reshape her memory. She didn't. That kind of steadiness under pressure isn't something children are born with. It comes from going through something terrible and deciding, with help and time and patience, that you are not going to let it be the last word on who you are. I still have the photo of her drawing on my desk. The dark lines pressing in, the small figure standing with both arms out, the names written around the edges. The lines couldn't reach her because of the people standing around her. I want to be one of those people for as long as I'm standing.